Welcome back to the show. We are cracking open a special edition today, something we call Reformed Thinking.
It is good to be here.
For anyone new, this is where we step away from the headlines, the noise of the daily news cycle. Instead, we pull a significant theological text off the shelf. And yeah, usually it's pretty dusty, usually written by a guy in a wig, and we just try to figure out what makes it tick. We want to see how these old arguments hold up and what they might mean for us right now.
Right. We're looking for the logic, the theology, and, the practical application. How do these ideas actually shape the way we live and worship?
And today we are taking on a heavy hitter. We're looking at Jonathan Edwards.
The American Puritan, a giant of the faith, for sure.
The man himself. Now, I feel like we need to clear the air before we even really start. When most people hear the name Jonathan Edwards, their minds go to one very, very specific place. They think of that one sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Which is understandable. I mean, it is probably the most famous sermon ever preached on American soil.
Right. Fire, brimstone, the spider dangling over the pit. It's intense. And because of that, I think people really caricature Edwards. They think of him as this emotional manipulator who just wanted to scare people into heaven. But that's not really the whole picture, is it?
Not at all. In fact, that's a massive misunderstanding of the man. Edwards was arguably the greatest philosophical mind America has ever produced. He was a logician. He was so rigorous. He wasn't just trying to get a reaction. He was trying to get to the truth. He wrote about the beauty of God, the nature of true virtue, the psychology of the affections.
And today we're looking at a treatise that is just pure logic. It's titled The Perpetuity and Change of the Sabbath.
It's a fascinating piece of work. It addresses a very specific and I think very practical problem.
Really, this he does. It deals with the rhythm of our lives. We all know the 10 Commandments. We know the Fourth Commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
It's right there in Exodus 20. Can't miss it.
But here's the snag. The commandment specifies the seventh day. You look at a calendar, and the seventh day is Saturday. That's the day the Jews rested. That's the day God rested in Genesis. But then you look at the Christian church. For 2,000 years, the vast majority of Christians have gathered for worship on Sunday, the first day of the week.
It's the classic Sunday school question, isn't it?
It is. And it makes you wonder, did we just make that up? Did the church just sort of decide they liked Sunday brunch better? Or is there actually a biblical mandate, a command from God that authorizes shifting that holy day from Saturday to Sunday?
Edwards believes there is, and in this treatise, he sets out to prove two things. First, he wants to prove that the obligation to keep a Sabbath hasn't vanished. It's perpetual. It applies to us just as much as it applied to Moses.
And second?
Second, he wants to prove that the day was divinely changed. He argues that the shift from Saturday to Sunday wasn't an accident or some human invention. It was, for him, a necessary theological shift to honor something even greater than the physical creation.
So the mission for this deep dive is to trace his steps. We want to walk through his scriptural logic and see if his argument holds water. And honestly, he starts in a place I never would have guessed. He anchors his opening argument in a verse about fundraising.
It does seem like a strange place to start a theological treatise on the Sabbath. He opens with 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2.
Let me grab that text. Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. He says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye."
Right. And let's pause there for a moment. We need to set the scene so we understand what's happening. This isn't just, passing the plate to keep the lights on in the building. This is a crisis response.
Right. This is the collection for the saints in Jerusalem.
The church in Judea was in really bad shape. They were facing a severe famine. On top of that, they were being persecuted by their own countrymen for following Jesus. They were impoverished. So Paul is organizing this massive international relief effort. He's getting the Gentile churches to send money to the Jewish believers.
It's a unity project as much as it is a charity project.
Precisely. So in verse 2, Paul gives them the logistics. He tells them how to do it. He writes, "Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come."
Okay, so on the surface, this sounds like administrative advice. Put money aside on Sunday so you don't have to scramble for cash when I get there. Why does Edwards think this is the smoking gun for the Sabbath?
Well, it comes down to the specificity. Edwards argues that Paul isn't just giving a random tip here. He is establishing a pattern. Notice the phrase, upon the first day of the week.
He doesn't say whenever you get paid. He doesn't say at the end of the month.
Correct. He pinpoints a specific day. Now, you might argue, well, maybe Sunday was just market day in Corinth. Maybe that was just the convenient day for them.
That would be the skeptic's counter-argument. But Edwards has a rebuttal for that, right?
He does, and it goes right back to verse 1. Paul says, "As I have given order to the churches of Galatia."
And geography matters here.
It matters a great deal. Galatia is not next door to Corinth. We're talking about a completely different region. They are separated by hundreds of miles by land and sea. They have different local economies, different customs, different market days. If this instruction was just about local convenience in Corinth, Paul wouldn't have given the exact same order to the churches in Galatia.
So the fact that he's telling multiple churches in different parts of the world to perform this specific religious duty on the first day implies that the first day meant something special to all of them.
That is the argument. Edwards says this proves the first day was already viewed as the proper time for corporate religious duties in the apostolic church. Why would you set aside money for the Lord on that particular day? Because that's the day you're already focusing on the Lord.
It implies a synchronization. The church wasn't just meeting whenever they felt like it. They had a set rhythm.
And Edwards connects this to Jewish history to strengthen his point. He cites Jewish historians like Philo and Josephus, and they note that in the Jewish tradition, the Sabbath, their Saturday Sabbath, was the standard time for collecting alms and doing works of charity.
Ah, I see the connection now. So if the Jews did their holy collections on the Sabbath, which was Saturday, and Paul is commanding the Christians to do their holy collections on the first day,
then he's subtly indicating that the sacred time has moved. The container for these holy duties has shifted from the seventh day to the first day.
that's a clever deduction. It's not a proof text that says, thou shalt switch days, but it shows the mechanics of the early church in action. It's a functional argument.
And we see it elsewhere in the New Testament, too. Acts 20.7 is another famous one. Upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them.
Right. It wasn't random. Luke makes a point of saying they were gathered for the Eucharist and for preaching, and he specifically flags it as the first day.
So Edwards establishes that the early church was clearly treating Sunday as special. But before he can fully defend the change of the day, he has to back up and defend the existence of the day.
This is his first major proposition, the perpetuity of the Sabbath.
Because you have to remember, there are two ways to attack the Sunday Sabbath. One way is to say it should be Saturday. The other way is to say, don't need a Sabbath at all.
And there are plenty of people who argue that. They say, we are under grace, not law. The Sabbath was a Jewish shadow. It's gone. Every day is holy now.
Edwards wants to dismantle that idea before he moves on. He starts with an argument from reason and nature. He actually steps away from the Bible verses for a second and just looks at human beings.
I love when he does this. He's a psychologist as much as a theologian. What's his argument here?
He starts with our limitations. We're finite. We are not like God. We can't multitask infinitely. He argues that if we don't set a fixed time for God, the world is going to crowd him out.
That is just a fact of life. I feel that every week.
It is. Think about your own schedule. If you say, I'll go to the gym when I feel like it, or I'll read a book when I have some free time, what usually happens?
It never happens. The tyranny of the urgent takes over. Emails, errands, whatever's right in front of you.
Edwards says the same is true for worship. Unless there is a designated time, a line in the sand, our secular concerns will just swallow up our spiritual duties. We are too weak to maintain a constant spiritual high without a structure to support it.
But he goes beyond just the individual. He talks about the sociological need for a special day.
Right. Public worship requires synchronization. It's a logistical reality. We can't support each other in faith. We can't have a real community. If you're worshiping on Tuesday morning, I'm worshiping on Thursday night, and someone else is worshiping on Saturday at noon.
We have to agree on a time to gather. It's that simple.
And Edwards points out the psychological power of a shared observance. He notes that when a whole society engages in a focused activity, whether it's mourning or rejoicing or worship, it strengthens the individual's spirit.
That's so true. Being in a stadium for a big game feels completely different than watching it alone on TV.
Or attending a funeral. The shared grief somehow validates and supports your own grief. Edwards says a set Sabbath creates a shared atmosphere of reverence. It helps us focus on God in a way we simply couldn't do in isolation. So reason tells us we need a day.
But reason doesn't tell us which day or how often.
Correct. Reason tells us some time is necessary. But how much time? Edwards argues that we just aren't smart enough to figure out the perfect proportion on our own.
If it were left to us, we might say once a year is fine, like a spiritual holiday.
Which would be too seldom. We would forget God in the interim. Our spiritual lives would atrophy.
Or we might get overzealous and say every single day should be a Sabbath.
Which would be impossible, because we have to eat and work and take care of our families. So Edwards argues that God, in his infinite wisdom, determined that 1 in 7 is the ideal rhythm for humanity. It's frequent enough to keep our spirits alive and focused, but it leaves enough time for our secular labor.
And he traces this back way before Moses. This isn't just about the Ten Commandments for him. He goes all the way back to creation.
This is the creation argument, and it's vital for his case. He looks at Genesis 2. God finished his work, and he rested on the 7th day. Now, Edwards asks the obvious question. Why did God rest?
It certainly wasn't because he was out of breath. Phew, making those stars was heavy lifting. That's not how it works.
God is omnipotent. He doesn't have muscles to fatigue. He doesn't need a nap. So if he didn't rest for his own sake, he must have done it for our sake.
He was setting a precedent, a pattern.
He was establishing a pattern for the beings he had just created in his image. And Edwards argues that since this pattern was set at creation thousands of years before there was a Jew or a law of Moses, it applies to all mankind. It is a creation ordinance, like marriage. It's built into the hardware of the world.
Okay, so we've established that 1 in 7 is a moral necessity and a creation pattern. But now we have to deal with the law, the Ten Commandments. And this is where we have to get a little technical. We need to distinguish between moral law and ceremonial law.
This is a classic distinction in Reformed theology, and Edwards leans on it heavily. It's a critical piece of his argument.
Let's break that down for the listener. What is the difference?
A moral law is something that is based on the character of God. It's inherently right. For example, do not murder.
That's always true for everyone, everywhere.
Right. It was true for Adam. It was true for David. It's true for us today. You will never be okay to murder. A ceremonial law, on the other hand, is typological. It points to something else. For example, the dietary laws. Do not eat pork. Or the sacrificial system.
Those were temporary. They were for specific people, Israel, for a specific time.
Correct. Once Christ came and fulfilled those pictures, the shadows went away. We don't sacrifice goats anymore because the Lamb of God has come and fulfilled that picture.
So the big question is, where does the Sabbath fit? Is it do not murder, or is it don't eat pork?
Edwards says it is moral. It is part of the permanent law. And his first piece of evidence is its location. The Fourth Commandment is in the Decalogue. It was written by the finger of God on tablets of stone. That implies permanence. It sits right there next to do not commit adultery and do not steal.
But I've heard people argue for what they call a spiritual Sabbath. They say, I don't need a specific day because I rest in Christ every day. My whole life is a Sabbath.
It sounds very pious, doesn't it?
It sounds super spiritual, very advanced.
Edwards calls it absurd.
Absurd. That's strong language.
Well, just follow the logic. The Fourth Commandment specifically regulates time. It says, 6 days shalt thou labor, the 7th thou shalt rest. It is a command about rhythm and proportion.
Okay.
If you interpret that to mean be holy all the time or rest spiritually every moment, you have effectively destroyed the commandment. You've turned a command about time into just a general summary of religion.
It would be like taking the command, do not steal, and saying, well, spiritually, I just need to be generous in my heart while I'm actively robbing a bank. The action matters.
That's the point. You can't keep a command about stopping work by never stopping work. The command requires an actual pause, a cessation of labor.
This leads us to another distinction Edwards makes, one that is really helpful. The difference between moral and positive.
This is a bit deeper, but stay with us because it's key. A moral precept is something evident by nature like loving God or not killing. A positive precept is something that is right simply because God commanded it.
Like the tree in the Garden of Eden, don't eat that particular fruit. There was nothing poisonous about the fruit itself. It was wrong because God said no.
That is a positive law. It's an expression of God's sovereignty. And Edwards argues the Sabbath is a mix. The need for rest is moral. It's built into our nature. We need it. The proportion 1 in 7 and the specific day, Saturday or Sunday, is positive. It's a specific appointment by God.
And Edwards argues that God has the right to change positive laws.
Exactly. The moral part, the fact that we need a day of rest, stands forever. The positive part, which specific day it is, remains in God's authority to adjust as he sees fit.
Edwards then brings in some prophetic evidence to nail down this idea that the Sabbath is perpetual. He goes to Isaiah 56.
This is a beautiful text. It's a prophecy about the strangers, that is, the Gentiles and the eunuchs joining the people of God.
Now, under the Old Testament ceremonial law, eunuchs were excluded from the assembly. Deuteronomy 23 is crystal clear on that.
Correct. But here in Isaiah, looking forward to the gospel age, God says he will give the eunuchs a name better than sons and daughters. He's bringing the outcasts in. But notice the condition. What characterizes these faithful Gentiles and eunuchs?
Yeah, keep my Sabbaths.
There it is. In a prophecy describing the time when ceremonial laws like the exclusion of eunuchs are abolished, the Sabbath is explicitly upheld.
That's a strong point. If the Sabbath was just a ceremonial shadow destined to vanish, why would Isaiah make keeping it the identifying mark of the faithful believer in the gospel age?
It implies that the Sabbath remains even when the other ceremonial barriers fall. It's in a different category.
And then there's the word of Jesus himself in Matthew 24.
Right. Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, predicting the destruction of Jerusalem. He is talking about the Roman armies surrounding the city.
Which happened in 70 A.D. That's 40 years after the cross.
Important timeline, 40 years into the Christian era. And Jesus tells the disciples, "Pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day."
If the Sabbath was going to be abolished at the cross, why would Jesus care if they fled on the Sabbath 40 years later? It wouldn't be special anymore.
Precisely. If the Sabbath was dead and gone, fleeing on a Saturday would be the same as fleeing on a Tuesday. Jesus' warning implies that a Sabbath observance would still be in force and still be significant for his followers long after the resurrection.
Okay, so Edwards has built a fortress around the idea that we still need a Sabbath. He's used reason, the Ten Commandments, prophecy. But now we hit the hardest part. The text of the commandment says the seventh day, Saturday. How can Edwards justify moving it to the first day without breaking the commandment?
This is where Edwards puts on his linguist hat. He looks very closely at the wording of the Fourth Commandment. It says, 6 days shalt thou labor, and the seventh thou shalt rest.
Okay.
Edwards argues that the essence of the command is the ratio. 1 day of rest after 6 of labor. It establishes a rhythm. It does not, he argues, technically establish the absolute starting point of the count for all eternity.
Can you explain that with an analogy that's a little abstract?
Sure. Think about the command to honor thy father. That command applies to me and it applies to you. But thy father for you is a different person than thy father for me. The object of the command changes based on our relationship, but the command itself remains the same. Edwards argues the seventh day is relative to when God starts the week. If God says, start working now, then the seventh day from now is your Sabbath.
So the command is, work 6, rest 1. It's a relative count, not an absolute date on a cosmic calendar.
Essentially. And Edwards throws out a fascinating historical theory here. It's speculative, he admits, but it's very interesting. He suggests that the Israelites might have actually lost the original track of time while they were slaves in Egypt.
I had never thought of that. They were slaves for 400 years. That's a long, long time. It's a brutal grind.
And slaves don't get calendars. They certainly don't get weekends off. The Egyptians weren't letting them keep a Sabbath. So Edwards suggests that over 4 centuries of brutal servitude, the original weekly count from creation might have been lost.
So when God gave them the manna in Exodus 16 and reinstituted the Sabbath, he might have been setting a new schedule for them.
It's possible. He might have been starting a new count based on their deliverance from Egypt. So the Jewish Saturday Sabbath might have been a specific appointment for that nation, tied to their exodus, rather than the absolute original timeline of the universe.
That opens the door for God to reset the clock again when an even greater deliverance happens.
And that brings us to the absolute core of his argument, the shift from the old creation to the new creation.
This is the theological pivot. This is where we move from following rules to understanding the gospel.
We have to understand how Edwards views history. He sees 2 great works of God. You have the old creation, Genesis 1. God makes the heavens and the earth.
It is good.
It was good. Very good. But then what happens?
Sin, the fall. Adam ruins it.
Right. And Edwards quotes Jeremiah 4.23 to describe the state of the fallen world. Jeremiah looks at the earth and says, it is without form and void.
That's the exact same language used in Genesis 1 before God started creating. It's a return to chaos.
Exactly. Edwards argues that the old creation was marred. It was ruined by sin. It became a spiritual wasteland.
And then comes the new creation,
Which is the work of redemption by Jesus Christ. It is the work of restoring what was lost and so much more.
Edwards cites Isaiah 65:17 here. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered.
The former shall not be remembered. That is a staggering statement when you think about it.
It is. It suggests a complete replacement.
Edwards latches onto that. He asks a simple, powerful question. If the old creation is to be forgotten, or at least so overshadowed that it's not remembered, by the glory of the new creation, then why would we keep celebrating the holiday of the old creation?
I see where he's going. Saturday commemorates God resting after making the physical world. Sunday commemorates Christ resting after saving the world.
And which work is greater?
Well, for a Christian, the work of redemption is definitely greater.
Edwards agrees. He says, creation gave life. Redemption saves from eternal death and grants eternal glory. Think of it this way. Is it a greater work to build a beautiful house, or to run into that same house while it's burning down and save the people inside at the cost of your own life?
Saving the people, no question.
Redemption is the greater work. It displays more of God's attributes, his mercy, his justice, his love, than the physical creation ever could. Therefore, Edwards argues, the new Sabbath that commemorates Redemption Sunday must take precedence over the old Sabbath that commemorates creation.
That is beautiful logic. It shifts the whole focus. We don't worship on Sunday just to be different from the Jews. We worship on Sunday because that is the birthday of the new creation.
It changes the motivation entirely. It's not about what we're not doing, it's about what we are celebrating.
And Edwards uses typology to really drive this home. He compares the Exodus from Egypt to the resurrection of Christ.
Typology is one of those words we use in Reformed circles a lot. It's the study of types and shadows. These are Old Testament events, people, or institutions that prefigured New Testament realities.
Okay, so let's look at the type. Deuteronomy 5.15 explicitly connects the Jewish Sabbath to remembering the deliverance from slavery in Egypt. Remember, you were a slave. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day.
Right, so the Jewish Sabbath was a weekly memorial of freedom from Pharaoh. But Edwards asks the next logical question. What was Egypt a picture of?
In the Bible, Egypt is almost always a symbol of spiritual bondage. It represents sin and the world system.
And what was the Exodus a picture of?
Salvation, being brought out of darkness into light.
So here's the argument, and it's so powerful. If the Jews had a weekly party to celebrate the shadow getting out of Egypt, shouldn't Christians have a weekly party to celebrate the substance getting out of hell?
That is a mic drop moment.
It really is. We have the reality. They had the picture. Why would we keep celebrating the day that remembers the picture when the reality has already come in its fullness?
And he gets even more specific with the imagery. He aligns the timeline of the Red Sea crossing with the resurrection.
This is one of those details that makes you appreciate how closely these guys read their Bibles. When were the Israelites actually delivered?
They crossed the Red Sea, the waters parted.
Think about the imagery of that. They went down into the sea, walls of water on both sides. It was a valley of the shadow of death.
It's like a tomb. It's a burial.
Exactly. And when did they come out on the other side? Safe and free?
It says in the morning watch.
Edwards connects this to Psalm 69 and the book of Jonah. The deep waters are a constant biblical symbol of death and judgment. Christ rising from the grave is the antitype of Israel coming up out of the sea.
So just as the Jews' day of rest began when they climbed out of the Red Sea on the other side, safe from the Egyptians in the morning.
The Christian day of rest begins when Christ climbs out of the grave in the morning, having defeated death and sin. The timeline matches perfectly. The resurrection is the greater Exodus.
This leads us to the concept of Christ's rest. I think this is one of the most fascinating parts of Edwards' entire argument. He goes to Hebrews 4.
For he that is entered into his rest, he also hath ceased from his own works, as God did from his.
Now, usually when I read that verse, I think it's talking about me. You know, if I enter God's rest through faith, I stop working for my salvation. I stop trying to earn it.
And that is a valid application of the text. But Edwards argues the primary meaning refers to Christ, who is the he that entered into rest. It's Jesus.
So let's parallel it. God the Father worked for 6 days in creation, and then he rested.
And Christ worked through his life and ministry. Think of his entire life as a work week. It was a work of humiliation, of suffering, of perfect obedience. It was hard, painful labor.
And then, on the cross, he said, "It is finished." The work was done.
And he went into the tomb, and on the first day, he rose. He rested from his labor of atonement. He ceased from his works.
So the resurrection is the beginning of God's new weekend, so to speak.
That's the idea. The pattern is reestablished. The work of new creation is done. Redemption is accomplished. Now we rest.
Edwards also brings in Psalm 118 here. We sing this all the time. The stone which the builders refused is become the headstone of the corner.
And the very next verse. This is the day which the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it.
This is the day, this is the day. I sang that in Sunday school with hand motions. We all did.
We all did. But look at the context that the New Testament gives it. The refusing of the stone is the crucifixion. The becoming the head of the corner is the resurrection.
So when the psalmist says, this is the day, he isn't just talking about a generic sunny Tuesday. He's prophetically talking about Resurrection Day.
This is the day the Lord hath made. He made the resurrection day special. And the command is, we will rejoice and be glad in it. That's the definition of a Sabbath, a day appointed for holy joy and gladness.
This brings up a really somber point Edwards makes about the specific Saturday while Jesus was in the tomb.
It's a powerful observation. Think about that Saturday. We call it Holy Saturday now, but for the disciples, it was a nightmare.
Set the scene for us.
It's the Jewish Sabbath. The commandment says to rest and rejoice. But Jesus is dead. His body is wrapped in linen, lying in a cold rock tomb. The disciples are hiding in a locked room, terrified that the Romans are coming for them next. Their hopes are shattered.
It was probably the darkest day in human history. God was dead, from their perspective.
Edwards asks, could that possibly be the day of Christian celebration?
No. The bridegroom was taken away from them.
Exactly. Jesus said, when the bridegroom is taken away, then they will mourn. Saturday was a day of mourning. The Lord of the Sabbath was dead. It would be completely unfitting to celebrate the joy of the new creation on the very day the Creator was lying under the power of death.
The joy returns in the morning, on the first day.
And that is why the Sabbath had to shift. The tone of the day changed from the gloom of the grave to the glory of the empty tomb. You cannot have a Sabbath while the king is dead. You have the Sabbath when the king is risen.
This brings us to the final leg of the argument. We've done the theology, we've done the typology, now we need the history, the apostolic authority. Did the apostles actually treat Sunday as the new Sabbath?
Edwards says yes, and the evidence starts with Christ himself. After the resurrection, when does Jesus appear to his disciples?
He appears on that first Easter Sunday in the evening.
And then John specifically notes in John 20.26, and after 8 days again, his disciples were within, and Jesus came 8 days later. That's the next Sunday.
He seems to be setting a weekly meeting time with them.
He is establishing a pattern. He ignores the Saturday in between and shows up on the first day to be with his people.
And then there's Pentecost, the pouring out of the Holy Spirit.
A huge moment. The birth of the church as we know it. If you do the math from Leviticus 23, the Feast of Pentecost always falls on the first day of the week.
So the church was born on a Sunday. The Spirit was poured out on a Sunday.
And then we have the specific term, the Lord's Day. In Revelation 1.10, John is in exile on Patmos. He writes, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day.
Now, some people try to say that just means the day of the Lord, like the end times, or the Sabbath in general.
But Edwards compares the phrasing to the Lord's Supper.
Ah, I see that.
The Lord's Supper isn't just any dinner. It's a specific meal set apart, owned by Christ for a holy purpose. Similarly, the Lord's Day isn't just any day. It is a specific day owned by Christ. And historically, from the very first century, we're talking about guys like Ignatius and Justin Martyr, the generation right after the apostles, the universal church understood this term to mean Sunday, the first day of the week.
But here's the question that always nags people. And I think it's a fair question. If this is so important, why didn't Jesus just say it? Why isn't there a verse in Matthew where Jesus says, hear ye, from now on, Sabbath is Sunday? Why the silence?
This is Edwards' argument from silence, and it's really quite brilliant. He talks about the tenderness of the apostles toward the Jews.
Tenderness? What do you mean?
Think about the Jewish context. The Sabbath was their identity. It was deeply, deeply ingrained in their culture for 1,500 years. God had punished them severely for breaking it. The exile happened in part because they broke the Sabbath. They were terrified of violating it.
So if the apostles had come out swinging on day one and said, Saturday Sabbath is illegal, we're doing Sunday now, it would have caused a riot.
It would have been a massive stumbling block. It would have shut the door to the gospel for countless Jewish people. It would be like asking them to eat pork on day one of their new faith. You just wouldn't do it.
New wine in old bottles. You can't just force it.
Precisely. Jesus and the apostles introduced the change gradually. They established the new day by their own example meeting on Sundays, breaking bread on Sundays, collecting alms on Sundays, while allowing the old practice to fade away naturally.
It was a transition, not a revolution.
It was a gracious weaning. As the temple was destroyed in 70 AD and the church became more and more Gentile, the Saturday observance naturally fell away, leaving the Lord's Day standing tall. God treated the infant church with patience, leading them into the full truth as they were able to bear it.
So where does that leave us? We've walked through the arguments. Edwards says the Sabbath is a moral necessity. We need it. He says the day changed because the work of redemption is far greater than the work of creation. He says the resurrection is the new rest.
And he says that Christ and the apostles sanctioned this first day as the Lord's Day, establishing it by their practice.
It's a really compelling case. It moves the Sabbath from being a burden of the law that you have to grit your teeth and get through to being a celebration of the gospel.
That is the key. It isn't about rules. It's about rejoicing. It's a gift.
And Edwards leaves us with a provocative thought at the end of his treatise. He challenges the listener to compare their joy with the joy of the Old Testament Jews.
This is the application. He says, look at the Jews. They celebrated the Sabbath to remember getting out of physical slavery in Egypt. That was a great physical deliverance.
They got out of slavery. A huge deal for them.
We celebrate the Lord's Day to remember being saved from eternal hell and brought into God's family forever. We have a better deliverance.
A much better deliverance.
We have a better reason to celebrate. Precisely. So Edwards argues that if we have a far greater reason to rejoice, then our observance of the Lord's Day should be more joyful, more spiritual, and more reverent than theirs ever was.
Ouch. That one hits home. Do I treat Sunday with more reverence and joy than an ancient Israelite? Or is it just the day I catch up on sleep and watch football?
It's a searching question for all of us. If this is truly the day the Lord has made to honor the purchase of our souls, it deserves more than a casual nod. It should be the highlight of our week, not an interruption to it.
A day of delight, as Isaiah says, not a day of drudgery.
A day where we step into the reality of the new creation, even if just for 24 hours, we practice for heaven.
That is a lot to chew on. I hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on why we do what we do on Sundays. It's not just tradition. It is theology in action.
It's the gospel written into our calendars.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Reformed Thinking. We encourage you, this coming Lord's Day, to think about the empty tomb, think about the new creation, and maybe, just maybe, find a little more joy in the rest.
Amen to that.
We will see you next time on The Deep Dive.